Hello, and thank you for joining me in this Baltimore County Master Gardener's talk about the pollinators in our gardens. My name is Sarah Yashua, and I've been a Baltimore County Master Gardener since 2014. In this program, I learned how essential insects are as part of a healthy ecosystem, and I also discovered that many of our most beneficial bugs are in drastic decline. With the Baltimore County Master Gardener Pollination Team, we reach out to the community and explain the importance of our pollinating insects for our gardens, for our landscapes, and hopefully for our food supply as well. So let me share my screen and let's talk pollinators. There we go. Now, without pollinating animals, most of our flowering plants would be in jeopardy. And this includes many of our most nutritious and tasty foods, such as our fruits, our nuts, our berries, and many of our vegetables. Our dinner plates would be so boring without our pollinators. So it's really important that we all learn how to help support healthy pollinators so that they can keep doing that incredibly important job that they do, not just for us, but for our children, our grandchildren, and hopefully for many generations yet to come. The Master Gardeners is a University of Maryland extension program under the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources that takes that science-based knowledge about healthy, sustainable gardening and landscape management practices and makes it available to everyone in the community through various outreach programs. If you're interested in learning more about us, or if you have any questions about your gardens or your landscapes, projects you're considering, or if you have a pest problem that you need some help with, then please visit the University of Maryland Extension website. Today we're going to talk about the pollinators in our area. Who are they? Why are they important? What they need to survive. We'll touch briefly on the threats to their survival, and finally we'll discuss those things that we can do to help promote healthy pollinators. Over 75% of the flowering plants in the present day require animals for transferring their pollen, and that's almost exclusively insects. The insects visit the flowers for food, the nectar provides sugars for energy, and the sole purpose for the plant to produce that nectar is to lure animals in to visit their blossoms. It's kind of like the payment that the plant makes for having its pollen personally delivered. Pollen is also very nutritious. It's packed with protein, essential amino acids, it's got fats, it's got carbs, and in the case of our bees, turns out it's perfect baby food as well. Pollination occurs when the grains of male pollen stick to the insect as they forage for food and are then transferred to the sticky female stigma on a flower in the same species. The movement of pollen to the same flower or the same plant is called self-pollination, and many of our plants have devised strategies to prevent that from happening. The movement of plant to the pollen to another plant in the same species is called cross-pollination, and it's this mixing of genes through cross-pollination that results in more vigorous plants that are able to adapt to changing conditions. And of course, what do you think happens after an insect successfully pollinates a blossom? Of course, the plant's going to produce fruits and seeds. The ovary is going to swell to form a fruit or nut, and each fertilized ovule becomes a hard seed from which a new plant has the potential to grow. Our pollinators are bees, flies, butterflies, moths, wasps, beetles, and the new kids on the block are the hummingbirds. There are some bats that are very important pollinators, but you're not going to find any of those in Maryland. They're mostly in the southwest part of the country. There is one obvious thing that all of our pollinators have in common, and that's wings. Wings are so important because they allow that pollinator to spread the pollen to a much broader area, which greatly improves the genetic diversity of the plant species. All of the flowering plants compete to attract pollinators in to visit their flowers, and the different traits that they use to lure them in, such as their size, their shape, their color, their scent, and even their time of bloom, are called pollinator syndromes. And ever since flowering plants first appeared, these flower traits have been evolving to attract a specific group of pollinators, which greatly increases the chances of successful pollination. Some blossoms are more attractive to butterflies, other blossoms will be more attractive to beetles and other pollinators. But most of our flowers have evolved strategies to lure the bees in. It's this co-evolution between the plants and the insects that's resulted in this incredible diversity of species in our plants and our insects. A good example of that selective adaptation would be the deep red tubular blooms that have evolved to attract hummingbirds, but few insects can reach that nectar reward deep inside. Now we're going to meet our pollinators, and we're going to start with bees because they are the best pollinators by far for several reasons. First off, the bees tend to be hairy, which aids in transferring the pollen between the flowers. Almost all female bees have an area of special branched hairs called a scopa on their body that's specifically for collecting and transporting pollen. Most of our bees are going to have their scopa hairs on their legs, but there is one family of bees in this leafcutter family that has her scopa hairs on the underside of her abdomen. The main reason why bees excel as pollinators is because female bees collect pollen and nectar to take back to their nest to feed their young. All bee larvae eat pollen, and with few exceptions, our female bees are built to gather it. And it's this foraging for pollen to collect for their nest that makes them the superior pollinators of all. Everybody's already familiar with how important those European honeybees are for pollination. They are hardworking, fascinating animals that are essential for our large scale agriculture. The honeybees were introduced as a domesticated species from Europe back in colonial times, and they were brought for their wax to make candles because there was no electricity, and for their honey, of course, as a food sweetener. It's this domestication that makes those honeybees so incredibly important for our agriculture today, because you can take an entire colony of honeybees from 10 to 30,000 bees, you can put them in a box, you can put them on a truck, and you can cart them clear across the country for a major crop at bloom time. For instance, there's about 3 weeks in February when over 1 million acres of almond trees all come into bloom at the same time in that California Central Valley. And they bring in well over 2 million colonies of honeybees in order to pollinate all those blossoms. That's almost 40 billion bees. It's also close to 80% of all of our commercial honeybees in the country. Our large scale agriculture would simply not be possible without the pollination services of our commercial beekeepers. Even though honeybees have been here for hundreds of years as an agricultural species, they did not co-evolve with our local ecosystems, and they are not native to North America. There are about 450 species of native bees in Maryland alone that have been essential for the reproduction of our flowering plants for over 100 million years. Most of our native bees are small, gentle, solitary ground nesting bees that are drastically different from everything that you've heard about the European honeybees. There's no hive that has a single queen that lives for years and has tens of thousands of daughters helping tend her nest. There's no waggle dance giving directions to a good food source, perhaps miles away. And there is no honey, and there's no barbed stinger. With our native bees, you are very unlikely to get stung. They are programmed for flight before fight. In fact, no bees or wasps will sting you when they're visiting flowers because they don't defend the flowers. And of course, our males aren't going to sting you anyway because they just don't have the equipment. Bees diverged from wasps after the flowering plants first appeared. They're kind of like the wasps that went vegetarian. The vast majority of our native bee species are solitary nesters, with each female doing all the work to construct and provision her nest without any help. We have examples of the 5 families of bees that can be found in Maryland, starting off with the large carpenter bee. This bee is in the same family as your bumblebees and your honeybees, and it is our largest native bee, well known for chewing those nest cavities in unpainted and untreated timber. They look similar to a bumblebee, but they have this large, shiny, almost hairless abdomen. These bees are important for pollinating many important crops, such as our passion fruit, our blackberries, and our peppers. There are sweat bees, which are small to medium sized ground nesting bees, and some of the species are attracted to the salts in human sweat, which is, of course, how they got their common name. Most of our sweat bees are small, dark, pretty nondescript bees, but the most frequent visitor to our flowers and the most visible and easy to identify are these beautiful green metallic sweat bees. There are mining bees. These are small to medium dark bees that nest in the ground. That you can usually identify the mining bees because they carry their pollen collecting hairs high up on their hind legs and onto their thorax even. These mining bees nest in the ground in undisturbed areas that have sparse or bare soil, such as maybe a meadow. There are some families that might nest in lawns, but no worries, because mining bees have a stinger that's so weak it will not penetrate human skin. There are polyester bees. These are also called plaster bees or cellophane bees, and they're named for a waterproof cellophane like material that the female secretes in order to line her burrow and her brood cells. And these bees can actually nest in riverbanks because with that waterproofing, they can tolerate some periodic flooding. And finally, we have this blue orchard bee, or bob for short. And this is a mason bee that's in the leafcutter family of bees. And those are the bees that have the scopa hairs on the underside of their abdomen. These bees all nest above ground in tunnel-like structures, maybe on hollow plant stems or abandoned beetle holes in wood. And the mason bees got their name because they collect mud to use to divide brood cells in their tunnel nests. And these bobs, they are in a class by themselves when it comes to pollinating any early blooming fruit tree or berry bush in spring. And what's really interesting is their effectiveness at pollination is due to their lack of efficiency at actually getting that pollen back home to their nest. These mason bees are going to zigzag back and forth between the trees, and they belly flop all over the flowers, rubbing that dry pollen on the scopa hairs on the underside of their abdomen, and they leave substantially more pollen behind on flowers than other bees do. The blue orchard bees are raised commercially for orchard pollination. The bees easily perceive colors in the blue and yellow end of the spectrum, so flowers that are bright white, yellow, blue, or purple are most attractive to them. Red colors will appear almost black to a bee. However, they're still going to be very attracted to the small yellow disc flowers in the zinnia that you see here, or the stark white anthers on the poppy. And they're also going to be attracted by a strong floral or sweet scent. Many plants have devised nectar guides, which are visual cues that lead down to the nectar source. And they can be a contrasting color, such as you see in the iris here, or they can be ultraviolet, which is clearly visible to a bee's vision. This black-eyed Susan under a UV light reveals those dark ultraviolet nectar guides leading down to the nectaries. Some of our bee species have long tongues, and they can forage on those deep tubular blooms like this Monarda, which is in the bee, it's commonly called bee balm. And other bee families have short tongues, and they can only access the resources in the shallow flowers, such as this aster that you see here. Once a flower is fertilized, it stops producing nectar, and it might change color in order to signal to the insects that there is no more food. This aster was like mid-November last year, and you can see that there's only one small cluster of flowers that still has that vibrant yellow color. All the other ones have changed. And of course, those cellophane bees are all over the ones that are still producing nectar. Flies will visit flowers and drink nectar. Some of them eat pollen, and when they're feeding, they act as a pollinator. The flies are second only to bees in their importance for crop pollination, visiting up to 50% of our agricultural crops. And since flies don't tend to nest, they are able to really roam, spreading that pollen much further and increasing the plant genetic diversity. There are over 1,100 species of flies in Maryland. The syrphid flies, these are also known as flower flies or hoverflies, are the most prominent flies that we'll find visiting flowers. The larvae of most of these hoverflies are predators for insect pests, so they kind of do double duty. As a larva, they're doing pest control, and as an adult, they're a pollinator. The houseflies, taconid flies, and blowflies are other important fly families for pollination. The flies pollinate A few important food crops specifically, such as strawberries, onions, and our carrots. And some fruit trees have evolved to specifically attract flies, such as mango and our native pawpaw trees. And if you like chocolate, thank the flies because they're the ones that pollinate the cacao tree that produces the cocoa beans that makes our chocolate. The flies are attracted to scents. It's usually going to be a putrid scent that's somewhat like carrion, or they might be attracted to dull colors such as brown or deep purple blossoms. Now, many of our flies have devised strategies as a protection for predators by mimicking the bees and the wasps. You can see this syrphid fly looks a lot like a wasp, and I'm pretty sure this guy thinks he's a bumblebee. Butterflies are beautiful insects which evolved from moss millions of years ago, and since they're active during the day, we get to enjoy all their splendor. Maryland has over 150 species of butterflies and skippers, and they measure from about 3/4 of an inch wingspan up to about a 6-inch wingspan. They seek nectar and they accidentally pollinate the plants if the pollen grains stick to their bodies as they forage for the nectar food. Our butterflies have two pairs of wings that are covered in these tiny, beautiful scales. And they also have a super long proboscis that they coil up. And when they uncoil that, they can dip way down deep into those deep tubular blooms to sip the nectar down there. Our adult butterflies are going to favor bright red, pink, or purple blossoms. And the butterflies tend to prefer large, showy flowers, but they will forage on clusters of flowers if there's a good landing platform. Sweet scents draw butterflies in. You may have heard about the butterfly bush, the buddleia, which is not a good plant for our butterflies. Well, how can that be when it's always covered with butterflies? That's because this plant's a fooler. It draws the butterflies in with a scent they find absolutely irresistible, but it offers up only scant, poor quality nectar as the reward for all their work. There are several families of butterflies in Maryland, which includes the swallowtails, and these are the largest butterflies in the world, and most of the species do have a little tail on their hind wings. If you see a bunch of butterflies gathered together in a mud puddle, it's typically these male swallowtails that are gathering nutrients that they'll pass to the females during mating. There are gossamer wings, and these are our smallest butterflies, including coppers and this hair streak that you see here. The larvae of some of these species are carnivorous and they feed on aphids and ant larvae. So again, doing that double duty, pest control and pollinator. The brush-footed butterflies it's the largest family of butterflies that we have, and it has most of our best known species, such as our monarchs, our painted ladies, our fritillaries, and our buckeyes are all in this family. The brush-footed butterflies got their common name because they have greatly reduced forelegs that are covered in hairs, and it appears that these butterflies all only have 4 legs instead of the 6 legs that every insect has. They do have 6 legs, it's just that the first 2 are not very visible. There are skippers, which are small moth-like butterflies, and they're named for their quick, erratic, darting flight habit. You can usually tell the skippers because most of them hold their hind wings out straight from their body and their forewings up at a 45-degree angle. And finally, we have here whites and sulfurs. Unfortunately, these are typically considered agricultural pests because their host plants are in the cabbage and the pea family. So what is a host plant exactly anyway? Well, a host plant is any plant that an insect is able to eat. And most of our insect species are only adapted to eat specific plants. Now, it may be all the plants in a family of plants, such as the pea family, which is going to include clovers and soybeans and redbud trees in addition to your peas. Or it might be a specific genus of plant, such as all the plants in the Asclepias genus are going to be milkweeds. Or it might be just one single species of plant. And these are all called specialists. My favorite example of a single species specific specialist would be this little mining bee. It's an Andrena irrigenia. and she will only forage for pollen and nectar on spring beauty wildflowers. And since these flowers are only out for about 3 weeks in very early spring, she comes out early and she's got a lot of work to do to get her nest built and provisioned before there's no more food available for her. The insects that can eat from many plant families are called generalists, and that's going to be your honeybees and your bumblebees. And also, this Io moth as a caterpillar can eat from many plant families. While adult butterflies and moths can forage for nectar on almost any good source, all of our butterflies and most of our moths are specialists in their caterpillar stage, and they can only feed on the leaves of their host plants. One of the examples of this specialist relationship that I think everybody's probably familiar with are the monarch butterfly caterpillars, which can only eat milkweed leaves that are plants in the Asclepias genus. There are almost 10 times as many moth species as there are butterflies, with almost 2,000 species here in Maryland. But since they're mostly active at night, we really don't see all the diversity that they have. Since they feed at night, they search out their food by scent, and the plants that attract moths are usually going to have either white or pale flowers that reflect the moonlight, and they're going to be a night opening flower that emits a strong, sweet scent. Here we have pictures of several moths that have been caught out during the day. My favorite is this hummingbird moth in the video that looks a lot more like a hummingbird than what you would think of a moth looking like. Most of our moths have a wing coupling device which joins their forewings and their hind wings, so they frequently only appear to have two wings. They have four wings like a butterfly, but they frequently look like they only have two. Wasps form one of the most diverse species-rich families of insects, with over 1,200 species here in Maryland. And the adult wasps eat nectar, but they spend most of their time hunting insects and spiders for their carnivorous young offspring. The wasps are attracted to flowers by scent, usually a nice, strong, sweet scent, or they could be attracted to perhaps a sweet smelling beverage or to a sweet perfume as well. Only a very small number of our wasp species are social, which tend to be aggressive and territorial, such as our paper wasps, yellow jackets, and our hornets. So it's best to avoid areas where they're building their nest. But most of our wasp species are solitary, spending all of their effort and time in preparing a nest, and she only uses her stinger to paralyze that tiny prey that she's going to drag back to her nest to feed her young. It's pretty easy to identify wasps because they tend to have this abdomen that's obviously constricted near their thorax. And I usually tell by those long, spindly, hairless legs. They may have barbs or spines on them for holding their prey when they're dragging it back to the nest, but they're always going to be long and skinny and hairless. And this brings us to our beetles, which were the first insects to visit flowers, and they're still essential for pollinating many ancient species, such as our magnolia and our spicebush. And the flowers that are going to attract the beetles are going to be usually large solitary flowers with a bowl shape. They'll be white or dull white or maybe even green in color. The beetles are also attracted to a fruity or a spicy scent. Most of our beetles that feed at flowers eat pollen, and they might also eat several other plant parts, such as the leaf pieces and the flower petals and stuff like that. So the flowers that depend on beetles for pollination tend to produce large quantities of pollen, and they don't waste much energy in producing nectar. These beetles are not especially efficient pollinators, but they are one of our top pollinators due to their sheer numbers. With about 2,500 species here in Maryland, they make up the largest set of pollinating insects. And you can tell the beetles because they have these leathery forewings that form a shell like over their body, hiding their membranous hind wings that they use for flying. And those forewings form this straight line right down the middle of their back. Our pollinating insects are complete insects that go through four very distinct stages in their life cycle. They start out as an egg, which hatches into a larva. And the main job for this larva stage is to eat. They are going to grow as large as they're going to be as an insect during this larval stage. And once they're completed that, they're going to go into this pupa stage. This is where that magical, mystical metamorphosis thing happens, where a totally different animal comes out of their pupa when they're an adult. And of course, as an adult, they're going to spend all of their time and effort working at reproduction. So when you're looking for pollinators out in the gardens, be sure to look for them in their different stages. Our only significant bird pollinator is the ruby-throated hummingbird, which pollinates the blooms when they reach into the flowers and the grains of pollen stick to their feathers on their face. The hummingbirds prefer flowers that are bright scarlet and have deep tube-shaped flowers, but they're going to eat nectar from any good food source. While nectar feeds their high energy requirements, the primary diet of our hummingbirds are actually small insects. Now for the bad news. Pollinators, like most animals worldwide, are disappearing at an alarming rate, and there's several well-known causes for their decline. The greatest risk of all is habitat loss and fragmentation. As humans continue to take over ever expanding areas for our commercial properties, our suburban lawns, our agriculture, and other land developments, there's ever diminishing resources for our pollinating animals to survive. This is also where most people can make a real difference. Even in rural areas where you would think that our pollinators could thrive, most of our agricultural fields are too big to for many of our pollinators, especially our bees, to cross to reach forage on the other side. Pesticides can kill pollinators either directly or it can kill them over time from prolonged exposure. It can affect their reproduction or it can kill all the plants that they need to survive. And with bees, that toxin is frequently transferred to the developing bees in the nest on that collected pollen. The mass rearing of bees and butterflies for commercial purposes and distribution has resulted in the introduction of countless alien viruses and other diseases and mites such as and other parasites that our local populations have no resistance to. And as if all that isn't enough, climate change can break that synchronous relationship between a specialist pollinator, whose timing is based on warmth, and their host plants that respond to timing based on sunlight. So it is truly a challenging life for pollinators in our world today. The good news is it is really easy to help protect our pollinating animals. And the best way to help pollinators is to provide a safe habitat for them that provides food, water, shelter, and space to reproduce. And you want to have these undisturbed patches of habitat close together so that the pollinators can travel between the resources without risk. And of course, avoid using pesticides whenever possible. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about each one of these resources and how you can provide them. The main characteristic to consider with habitat location for a pollinator garden is that the site be in full sun for at least part of the day and that it be mostly open. The ideal here is to have shelter and forage resources in the same area so that they're not spending all their energy and risk in getting back and forth between sources. For pollen and nectar food sources, you want to plant a variety of trees, shrubs, flowers, and herbs. For your perennials and your annuals, you want to plant in patches of 3 to 7 plants, forming a really nice clump that's visible when they're flying by. And choose a really diverse group of plants with different sizes, shapes, heights, and colors. Do plan to have your garden providing food throughout the entire growing season, from early spring through late fall. And if those good forage plants just happen to be weeds, then consider leaving them to bloom as a resource for your pollinators before cutting them. Native plants provide the best food source for native pollinators due to coevolution, and most of our native bees have a strong preference for pollen from our native plants. Those native plants have a lot of advantages for us as well. They're less likely to require pesticides, they don't require fertilizers, they need less water, they're not invasive. Yes, we have some thugs out there that can be pretty darn aggressive, but technically they're not invasive. What they are is so incredibly important because they promote that native biodiversity that's essential for healthy, functioning ecosystems. And the ecosystem services that they provide are necessary for human life, such as clean air, clean water, and food. Try to use straight species and avoid the cultivars unless the cultivar has been cultivated for disease resistance. If a plant has been cultivated for pretty features, perhaps a colored leaves, longer lasting blooms, or maybe showier flowers, then the plant spends its energy on being pretty and doesn't have the energy to spend on those pollen and nectar resources that the straight species would have. There are countless good choices for native plants to support our pollinators, and there are several really good, reliable sources for recommendations, such as the University of Maryland Extension, the Xerces Society, the Pollinator Partnership, and the Maryland DNR, just to name a few. My personal favorite is this National Wildlife Federation Plant Finder that will help make recommendations for good native plants based on your zip code. Plus, they're working on a rating system for how beneficial they are for your pollinators. Again, use the straight species rather than the fancy cultivars, especially the ones with the double blooms, because that is almost always at the expense of the reproductive parts. Remember, right plant, right place. If the growing conditions are right for a plant species, it's going to do well without much help. And finally, please be sure that the plants and seeds you purchase have not been treated with systemic pesticides. The big box stores still frequently carry stock that has been treated, so you want to shop at trusted nurseries where you can get an honest answer that the plants you're purchasing have not been treated with a systemic insecticide. Some of the more successful plants to attract and shelter pollinating insects that we found in the Baltimore County Master Gardener Demonstration Garden are shown here. And you might be a little surprised that we're including grasses that are wind pollinated, but we include them because they have such great shelter value. And we would absolutely love for you to visit our demonstration garden and enjoy our pollinators in action. The flowers that bloom in very early spring are a critical resource for our early emerging bees, such as our new bumblebee queens, the mining bees, and the mason bees, and for our butterflies that overwinter as adults, such as our mourning cloak and our commas. The spring ephemeral wildflowers are an especially good early season source for foods. The bulbs that we plant for early blooms, such as our daffodils and our tulips, are highly derived and they're really not an especially good resource. They're not a very good resource at all for pollen and nectar. Though pollinators will forage on them if there's nothing else, but other options are better. The exception to that does seem to be the grape hyacinth, which I have found the pollinators very attracted to. The native early flowering trees are an excellent source of early season food for our pollinators, such as our native red maple, our native willows, our eastern redbud, the black cherry, and the wild crabapple are all good choices for early season. There is simply an abundance of really wonderful native summer blooming plants that provide quality pollen and nectar food sources. And we have a few examples of our super pollinator plants here. There's the Monarda, which is commonly called bee balm. There's the Liatris, which is called blazing star. Right here we have butterfly weed, which is a milkweed in the Asclepias genus, and almost any of the native milkweeds are great nectar sources. There's a trucium, which is called joe pye weed, and then this gaillardia is called the blanket flower. And in my garden, that blooms for almost 3 months straight, and it's always covered with a wide diversity of bees. But the plant that has really attracted the greatest diversity of all pollinators is this mountain mint, the pycnanthemum. And this blooms also for 2 to 3 months. Most sources are going to tell you that echinacea is not native to the mid-Atlantic, and that's true. But what it is an easy to grow composite that the bees and the butterflies love. So we say yes to coneflowers. Fall blooming plants are especially important energy source for those late season pollinators. Our next year's bumblebee queens have to really fatten up so that they can make it through the winter hibernation. And our monarch butterflies really need that fuel in order to continue on that epic journey that they make down to the oil mill fir forests in Mexico. So plant asters and goldenrods and ironweeds. They're all good choices. My personal favorite is this Monarda punctata, which is called the horse mint, and that's a long late season bloom. The best pollen and nectar resources, well, another really good pollen and nectar resource would be the native perennial sunflowers, such as this thin leaf or the oxeye sunflowers, are all really good choices. The annuals can provide a wonderful source of nectar and pollen all season long and well into late fall. And some of our favorites for the pollinators are the zinnias, the cosmos, the salvias, and the sunflowers, also the herbs and mints. But you have to let the herbs and mint bloom in order for them to be good pollinator resources. And some of those mints can be real spreaders, so you might want to put them in containers. Highly derived plants from the big box stores, such as our begonias, our geraniums, and our tea roses. They're beautiful because they've been cultivated for human aesthetics, but unfortunately, they really don't have much resources for our pollinators, so please don't plan on using these in your pollinator garden. There are also some flowering plants that have been cultivated for cut flowers, such as the sunflowers that you see here, that have no pollen to mess up your dining room table. So avoid using cut flower varieties in your pollinator garden as well. And be sure to plant plenty of host plants for your butterfly caterpillars. These are just a few examples of popular butterflies and their host plants. There's a long list of them available on several good resources. In addition to food sources, you may want to provide a water source in a shallow dish. You want to have sloping sides and plenty of perches with small stones and rocks. A muddy site in early spring would help provide the building material for those mason bees when they're building their nest, and the male swallowtails will puddle there, collecting their nutrients. And if you do a water source, then change the water 2 to 3 times per week during those warm mosquito breeding season, because it's much better to stop the mosquitoes in their larval stage rather than once they've matured and flown. Provide a safe place for your pollinators by keeping some untidy corners, maybe some undisturbed piles of woody debris or pruned stems. Logs on the ground are a perfect nesting and shelter area. If you can, leave your snags standing if they're not a risk to person or property. And please, please, please leave your leaves in the gardens. Leaf cover is an excellent area for shelter and nesting sites. You want to gently rake leaves from your lawn into your garden and leave them there year round. They'll help insulate your perennials in wintertime, keep them cooler in summertime. It'll cut down on your weeds by keeping them from contacting the soil and germinating. And they're going to improve your soil by putting the nutrients right back in. And your perennials are going to push right through that leaf cover in spring. Shelter is especially important during the times when the pollinating insects are inactive. So protect their overwintering sites by putting off your fall cleanup until spring. Once the daytime temperatures have been in the 60s for 5 consecutive days, then you can do a gentle tidying up. You do want to leave some bare soil covered, maybe a light layer of shredded leaves for our ground nesters. In fall, you can cut back your perennial stalks to 12 to 18 inches, and then they'll be used for next year's nesting materials. And that new growth in spring is going to quickly hide the leaf cover and the stalk stubble from people, but not from our bees. And finally, consider replacing areas of turf grass with beneficial habitat. Turf grass provides no food value and it reduces the nesting and shelter opportunities for our pollinators. The only thing you're feeding here are Japanese beetle grubs. And if having a mowed lawn is important to you, then consider raising your mower blade higher, such as 4 inches, and let the clover and violets and dandelions bloom before cutting. Better yet, replace areas of turf grass with a native tree and surround it with a low growing, shade tolerant native ground cover, such as the foam flowers you see here, that's Tiarella cordifolia. And you want to plant that out to the drip line. And this is a perfect way to improve your yard for a healthy space for our pollinators. Even if you don't have space for a pollinator garden, you can put out pots with beneficial food sources, such as annuals planted in them. A good way to help pollinators is to simply talk about them with family, friends, and neighbors. Unfortunately, way too many people only think of insects as pests, when in reality, only a very small percentage of our insects ever become pests to people. Mostly, people don't notice the insects that are living in the world all around us because they simply don't bother us. So help spread the word about the importance of our pollinators and managing our properties in a way that supports them. Other ways that you might be able to help would be to work with a group to install and maintain a pollinator garden in a public space, such as a school, a church, or a library. Or you could coordinate with your neighbors to do a corridor of pollinator habitat with pollinator gardens. And if you're a gardener, it's very important to learn that integrated pest management technique for controlling pests with the least toxic chemicals whenever possible. So, for more information about the integrated pest management, please visit the University of Maryland Extension Home and Garden Information Center website. This wraps up the talk about pollinators today, and I hope you found the information interesting and enjoyable, and you see just how easy and fun it is to help our pollinators. So I hope you get a chance to visit us in the Baltimore County Master Gardener Demonstration Garden. It's at the Agricultural Center on Shawan Road in Cockeysville, Maryland. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in our gardens.